We are in Exodus chapter 20 and starting the first commandment today. As we move through the commandments, I will typically be referring to them by their number. But if you grew up Roman Catholic, or Lutheran, or Jewish, etc., you may get confused along the way, because while Jews and Christians of all sort, are agreed upon the fact that there are 10 commandments, and the reason we're agreed upon them is because God counted them in Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 10, the covenant is said to exist in 10 commandments, so God told us how many they are. However, we're not all agreed upon what they are. But I'll be making that clear on the first commandment, as we do today, and not arguing in detail for the standard Protestant version, but I will at least explain how the different countings go. But first we shall read Exodus 20, verse 3, which by the Protestant enumeration is the first commandment, following what the Westminster Larger Catechism calls the preface to the 10 Commandments. That is I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Modern scholars would typically refer to that as the prologue to the covenant. And that is because, as we have learned a great deal more about ancient Near Eastern covenants, and that's not just Jewish covenants with God, but of the surrounding nations to Israel, particularly in the second millennium BC. Now you have to run your clock on that. What is the second millennium BC? Well, that's after the year 1000. That's backing from 1 to 2000. That'd be the second millennium BC. And that's the period of the Exodus. That's the period when God brings Israel out of it and makes a covenant with them. And as it turns out, the standard form of ancient Near Eastern covenants changed a bit in the first millennium. Okay? So you had kind of an older form giving way to a more modern form, first millennium BC. But it is a particularly important matter because if God's covenant with Israel, not just in Exodus 20, but especially the whole book of Deuteronomy, if the form of the covenant is the form of the second millennium BC, then that, of course, argues for the historicity of the Exodus and of the covenant. Because had it been a document, as some modern, more liberal scholars have argued, had it been a document that originated in the first millennium BC, then it would likely have had the form of first millennium BC covenants. If it actually bears the distinctive mark of a second century, second millennium BC covenant, then that argues for the historicity of the Sinai covenant originating in the second millennium BC. All right, so anyway, those covenants precede the giving of the laws, the major and minor stipulations of the covenant, what you're actually supposed to do as a partner in the covenant. Those laws are preceded by a prologue. And the prologue is normally a historical review of what the past relationships have been between the two parties. The form that God's covenant with Israel takes is the form known as a suzerainty vassal treaty. That means it's the form of a treaty that exists between unequal partners, between a great lord, the suzerain, what we might have called the sovereign, and the vassal. All right, these might be little kings of smaller nations, etc. They're now conquered peoples. And although they're allowed to remain as kings, they have to pay tribute to their lord, etc. So the covenant that God gives to Israel is in the form of a suzerainty vassal treaty, and the prologue in the book of Deuteronomy runs through most of the first 4 chapters. And it's a historical review of what has happened between God and his people. The purpose of the prologue is to motivate to obedience. All right? There may be an appeal to God's power, but in God's covenant with Israel, it's mostly an appeal to his love as revealed in his acts of redemption. And so in the, what you might call the miniature form of the covenant, the 10 Commandments on the 2 tablets, the prologue is, I am your God. I am Yahweh, your God. I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. All right, so God has bestowed upon them a great benefit. And they're his. And because he has been good to them in bringing them out of the land of Egypt, they should be motivated to serve him out of gratitude and love. It's not a bare assertion of power. I'm God, and I've got the biggest stick on the block. Obey me or else. It's not that. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So God motivates us to obey his covenant out of love, because he has done great things for us. And the first commandment then given is in verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. All right. Now, there's a couple of questions I want to raise just about the sentence itself. First of all, if you read in the King James Bible or in the Westminster Larger Catechism on this, thou. Why does the King James use thou? Because in 17th century English, thou was a singular you. It's not a more dignified and honorable way to speak to God or to another person. You use thou when you're speaking to an individual. And the 10 Commandments are given with thou. The Jewish rabbis believed that that was for the purpose of making clear that this covenant is binding upon each and every individual, not just upon a nation. In other words, we're not going to get a pass if most of the people are good in our country. Each and every person has a duty and an obligation to God. You, singular, thou shalt have no other gods before me. What is meant by before me? This really gets to an issue that I think is very, very important. I think for most people, if you ask them what it means to be a Christian, or what it means to be a faithful servant of God, will articulate it in terms of God having first place in your life. That's not what is going on in the first commandment. God is not telling you he should have first place in your life. He's claiming the only place in your life. Before me doesn't mean ahead of me. You shall have no other gods ahead of me. All your other gods should be behind me. It's not that. You shall have no other gods at all. You have no other gods in my presence. Before me means to stand before God, to be in his presence. And he's making claim that every aspect of our life is embraced by this covenant. There are no safe spaces from God's claim upon your life. There's no time that's reserved unto you. There are no thoughts and affections that are reserved unto you. He hasn't left you with any area of sovereignty over your life. Abraham Kuyper is an important and justly so figure in the history of Reformed thinking. He was a theologian who was the founder of the Free University of Amsterdam. He later became the prime minister in the Netherlands, so he was not just a churchman and a pastor and then later a theologian. He became a politician and achieved the highest office in the land, subordinate, of course, to the throne. But he was prime minister. In his inaugural lecture in the founding of the Free University of Amsterdam, he uttered a sentence which is probably the thing for which he is best known. If people know anything else about Abraham Kuyper, or if they don't know anything else, they probably know this. He said in that lecture that there is not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, the Lord of all, does not proclaim mine. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, the Lord of all, does not proclaim mine. He lays claim to the whole domain of human existence. Now, square inch is, of course, a measure in space. And oftentimes, Kuyper will be quoted as saying there's not a square inch in the whole cosmos. That is something that Kuyper believed. But his sentence was actually more focused than that. It's not merely that in the whole of the cosmos, spatially and temporally, that God is ruling. You see, God's providence right now embraces the planet Mars and every other planet, not just in our solar system, but in all solar systems throughout the cosmos. God's providence embraces them all. He determines everything that happens in those places. That is certainly true, and Kuyper believed it. But his claim concerned the whole domain of human existence. And so you see there was a moral aspect to this. It was not just an assertion of God's power and providence such that his purposes are fulfilled throughout the cosmos. It's that every aspect of human existence belongs to him. He owns you. He lays claim to us. He claims every thought in our mind, every affection of our heart, as well as every word that is spoken or every deed that is performed. He proclaims mine over top of it. So that everything we do, you see, has a moral aspect to it. Whether we are obedient to God or disobedient, whether we are honoring God or dishonoring God, takes place in every moment of our life and in every aspect of our being. He has left nothing to us. He is the Lord of all. And the first commandment, you see, is laying claim to that. You shall have no other gods in my presence. You see, this is why David's confession of sin in Psalm 51 makes sense. If you leave this out, it doesn't make sense. Against thee only have I sinned. And you're thinking to yourself, Uriah doesn't figure into this? I mean, he got killed. Bathsheba doesn't figure into this. Of course, we don't know whether Bathsheba cooperated or not. The Bible has no interest in Bathsheba's moral responsibility in this. She may well have been too free about where she took her baths and how long she stayed there. She may have been well aware of the fact that she was being watched and made the best of the opportunity, but the Bible has no interest in that. It is simply David's sin that is here. And when he confesses against thee only have I sinned, he's not leaving out the fact that bad things were done to Bathsheba and Uriah. He's not leaving out the fact that he has actually abused his power and thus sinned against his people as well, because he has set a model before the whole of his nation, and especially his army, concerning the priority of his selfish desires. There's sin against everybody in all of this. But he recognizes that it's only a sin against everybody because it is a sin against God. Had there been no God, you see, Uriah would not have been sinned against. He wouldn't have been happy with it, to be sure. He would have been displeased by the fact that he was being deserted by his army and left exposed before the enemy, etc. But no wrong would have been done there if there weren't a God in this world. You know, as Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, everything is permitted. And it's not just that it's permitted, there's nothing wrong about it. If there's no God, no one's ever done anything wrong. No one's ever been sinned against. It's just that things happened that other people didn't like. So all the so-called rights that we claim for ourselves, and put those in quotes, are derived. They're not inherent in us. They are universal to us, but only because of God. God lays it down. It became very fashionable in the time of the Enlightenment to speak of the rights of human beings. That's when the real human rights movement begins. We don't have any inherent rights. We have duties to one another because of God. God is the one who tells me I can't take another person's life. It's not because inherently they have a claim to their own life. It's only God that gives it. God lays a duty upon me and upon everybody else to honor your life. But you don't have a claim to it. And I don't have a claim to it. It rests in God and in God alone. So we all have duties. Okay? The rights that we have are derived. They've been given by God to us. He lays duties and obligations upon others so that we can speak of our rights being violated and so on, but it's actually that other people have failed in their duties. It's not so much that we had rights in and of ourselves. And the first commandment is laying that out. You shall have no other gods before me. He is the one source of moral obligation in the world. The one source of moral obligation in the world. Let me illustrate this two stories. If you've been around me very long, you know these two stories. One is from a young college co-ed, and the other was from a full professor at the University of Pittsburgh. The college co-ed first. All right, I'm getting on an airplane. I'm headed to Colorado. I'm supposed to teach for 2 weeks on the history and theology of the Reformed tradition and so on. And when I got on the airplane, I was not eager to talk to the first person I met about Jesus Christ. I just have to confess that right now. Okay? I was behind the 8 ball on this. I had my theology lectures laid out. I did not have my history lectures laid out. So I got on the plane, intended to spend the whole flight to Colorado working on my lectures and so on. So I'm sitting there with my book. What is my book? John T. McNeill's book, The History and Character of Calvinism. All right? Evidently, that's not the book I picked up at the local airport bookshop. All right? That's not found there. All right, so a young co-ed sits down. I've got the window seat. I've tried to get away from everybody and so on. I'm not even going to look at anybody. And a young co-ed sits down next to me, and she looks across the way, and she sees me reading that book, and she can see the title. And she just jumps right in. She says, "Are you a professor?" Well, at the time, I was still a pastor here. I said, "Well, most of the time I'm a pastor, but I'll be a professor for the next 2 weeks." She said, "You're going to teach on Calvinism?" Well, I could tell by the tone of her voice that was not a welcome thought. I thought, all right, Lord, this flight is gone. All right, put down the book. Let's talk to the co-ed. I said, yes, as a matter of fact, I am. I said, do you know anything about Calvinism? She said, yeah, I'm a history major. I know a little bit. Well, she knew one thing about Calvinism. Who knows what she knew about Calvinism? As a history major, Michael Servetus, exactly right. The fact that Michael Servetus was executed in Geneva. That's the one thing she knew about Calvinism. Who was Michael Servetus? Okay, he is a heretic. He has written a book against the Trinity. Okay, you don't do that in the 16th century. Anywhere. The Catholics wanted him. They were after him. The Protestants wanted him. The 16th century was not the birthplace of liberal arts colleges. Okay. That was not what went on there. You don't write a book against the Trinity and expect to retire on a beach villa in the Mediterranean. It doesn't happen. All right, so he was warned not to come to Geneva. There was no safe refuge for an anti-Trinitarian there. He came, he was arrested, and he eventually gets executed. That's the one thing she knew. Well, there were things about the 16th century that I thought she was ignoring. Servetus wasn't the only guy executed in the 16th century for heresy. People were being executed in all nations of the 16th century for heresy, all right? You got to have some understanding of the time and what's going on here. There wasn't some, monstrous evil that suddenly emerged in Geneva during that period of time. It was everywhere. All right, so there were a few things about it, but to be honest with you, I made no headway with her whatsoever. And then I realized, this was futile, so I said to her, well, you're a history major. What's your interest? Well, I'm interested in the colonial period of the Americas. I said, oh, really? I said, that's interesting. I said, because I happened to be at a conference, and I was talking to a guy who was actually writing his doctoral dissertation on the difference between Protestant and Roman Catholic colonies in how they treated Native American peoples. I said, well, she jumped in. She said, well, I'm not surprised. She said, it's kind of a hot topic in the field right now. I said, oh, really? I said, well, what's your take on it? I said, he seemed to think the Protestant colonies did a better job. Oh, no, she said, it was the Catholics. The Catholics did a much better job. She said the Catholics were respectful of Native American culture and religion. As long as you adopted Catholicism to be a part of it, you're okay. You can continue to worship your gods and have your festivals and whatnot. You just got to go to Mass and this, that, and the other. So the Catholics did it much more. But the Protestants, those people, it was their way or the highway. So on. Well, we talked a little bit about that, and we didn't come to any agreement. So we moved on again. And somewhere along the way, I dropped the phrase absolute truth. That caught her attention. She was quick off the starting line then. She said, I don't believe in absolute truth. And I just very quickly and almost dismissively said, well, I'm sure you do. And I started to move on. Well, she wasn't going to let me move on. She came back. She said, no, you didn't hear me. She said, I said I didn't believe in absolute truth. I said, I did hear you, and I'm sure you do. And she just kind of stared me down with a hairy eyeball, and she said, well, I don't. I said, well, young lady, then you're going to have to help me to clarify our conversation here, because I'm afraid I've misunderstood it from the beginning. I had the sense that when we talked about the execution of Michael Servetus in Geneva, I thought you thought something wrong had been done there. I did, she said. I said, was it absolutely wrong? And she just paused. I said, and then when we talked about the treatment of Native American peoples and their religions by the colonials, I got the sense that you thought the Protestants had done some great evil against Native American peoples. I did, she said. I said, was it absolutely wrong? She looked at me and I said, that's two. I said, now we've not been at this very long. I said, but my guess is you've already sized me up. The idea that somebody like me, holding the views that I do, should gain political power in the United States and be in a position to influence public policy toward my views, my guess is you'd think there was something wrong with that. You were right about that. And I said, and were I to do it? I said, would it be wrong? Would it be absolutely wrong? And she looked and I said, well, that's three. I said, we've been at this, 10 minutes? We've discovered 3 absolute truths that you believe. How much longer do you think it'll take us to discover a few more? And by this time, the bulb had gone on. She said, probably not long. I said, no, ma'am, it won't. I said, every moral opinion you hold, you believe to be an absolute truth. I think you better rethink what you mean by absolute truth. Because I think you hold as many as everybody else. You just don't agree with them on what they are. But you see, you can't have an opinion about right and wrong if you don't believe in an absolute truth. Unless you just think it's wrong because it's against your truth, which is I get to speak my truth. The first commandment doesn't allow you to speak your truth. Neither does the 9th commandment. It obligates you to speak God's truth because everything you speak is morally evaluated by God. And if you're speaking things you shouldn't speak as determined by Him, what you count to be your truth is your sin. And you should keep that in mind when you talk politics. Because it's fashionable now to speak against rulers. Regardless of which party you belong to and who's in power, it's very fashionable to speak against rulers. And God would tell you, have control of your tongue. Be careful of what you say, because you shall have no other gods before me. Well, of course, that was just the naive ramblings of a college co-ed. My college professors have the same mistake. Well, it came home to me in the very last class of my college career, the very last class. The last class was actually held during the final exam period. It was a class on public speaking. This was the 3rd semester. I had had this particular professor. He was a rabid atheist. He was a fascinating teacher of rhetoric, okay? And I had taken my first class in public speaking with him, and I'd say he's had a big impact on my life. I would say I probably learned more about public speaking from him than any preaching class I ever took. Now, that doesn't sound like a great accomplishment if you knew where I went to seminary, because we didn't have any great preaching classes or teachers there at the time. But every class that I had with him, 3 semesters, all began the same way. He'd come in, we have a big whiteboard across, and he'd walk in, and he'd write across the top of the board, AVROTIATMOU. And then he would tell us what the anagram was for. A vivid realization of the idea at the moment of utterance. That was the key to public speaking. The speaker must have a vivid realization of the idea at the moment of utterance. Without that, you can't persuade people. So that's how he geared us up. Well, why was I taking the class from an atheist? Well, I was preparing myself for service in the kingdom of God. And I had no idea who he was when I signed up. It was just a class on public speaking. I signed up and got in there. And I realized it was not just going to be a class on public speaking. It was going to be a wrestling match. He assigned 4 speeches, and every speech he got from me was on Jesus Christ. It fit the assignment. I did what I was supposed to do, but, we had freedom on our topic, and so I drove it home. And I did that all 3 semesters. 4 speeches every semester, every one on Jesus Christ. And the last class was called The Rhetoric of Social Change. He was trying to make us into 60s radicals. All right, he wanted us out in the street, marching against the wars, marching in favor of sexual freedom, marching in favor of marijuana and everything else and so on. He was a 60s radical, and he wanted to train us to do that. So it was the rhetoric of social change. So in our final speech, we had to move people to some public action. We had to try to persuade our class members to do some public action. Well, during that semester, I was leading the FCA Bible study, and we had a partnership with a lady who had cared for the poor in her neighborhood right off the university campus, a place called South Oakland in Pittsburgh. Her name was Fanny Royston. She was a fabulous lady. She was just the mother superior of the whole neighborhood, okay? Dear old Fanny. So that particular year, Fanny had a project. She wanted everybody to eat better, and to do that, she was trying to teach them how to raise vegetables. And so, Fanny, how can we help you? Well, she wanted us to buy onion sets. And we were going to give onions to everybody in South Oakland that was a part of her group and so on. So I was trying to get the class to go to our concert. We had a Christian musician coming in, and we were making it a benefit concert. I wanted to come. At the end of my speech, he'd given me $5. Told me he thought it was a good speech. He couldn't be there, but he thought it was a good thing. So, anyway, we got to the final exam period, and there were 3 more students yet to do their speeches. I was done. Most all of us were done. There were 3 more students who had to give their speeches, and it was reserved for the final exam period. We had already had our final exam during the semester, but the speeches were yet to come. Well, we showed up there. It was the last day of finals. It was the last period for finals. All right? This was Friday, 10 to 12. Middle of April, that's when the University of Pittsburgh gets out. Okay? Spring is in the air. Love is in the air. Graduation's in the air. We show up. None of the 3 students are there. And then he delivers the bad news. He says, I hate to tell you this, but we're going to have to stay here for the whole 2 hours. Because these students have any time during the next 2 hours to complete the work of this semester. And their work is a speech. And you had an audience for your speech. They need an audience for their speech. So we need to be here for 2 hours. So we may as well use our time profitably. Does anybody here have any questions over the past semester of anything we've talked about? Well, how many burning questions do you think there were on our minds? Middle of April, last day of finals, last 2 hours of school. How many burning questions do you think we had over the past semester? Not a one. All right? He said, well, it doesn't have to be on the things of this class. We've talked about a lot of things in this class through all your speeches and so on. It can be on anything at all. Does anybody have anything they'd like to speak about? Well, how many volunteers do you think there were? Well, I looked around the class. There was nobody volunteering, so I put up my hand. Mr. Ross, do you have something? Yes, sir, I do. He said, what is it you would like to offer? I said, well, nobody else has anything. I think we might profitably spend our time talking about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he said, and why do you think that would be profitable for the rest of us? I said, well, look at it this way. If the evidence is sound, that goes a long way toward proving that Jesus Christ is exactly whom he claimed to be. And if he is, that is important information for everybody that's in this class. He said, well, I take your point. What evidence do you think there is? So we started in. We did 10, 15 minutes back and forth. And then 2 of the 3 students showed up at the door. So obviously this is where we have to cut it off and go on. And what you would have expected is, okay, we got to cut this off and give the time to the 2 students. For whatever reason, I don't know what, he had never done anything like this before. But he said, well, we're going to cut this off. He said, but before we do, I've got one more thing I'd like to say. And he said, you 2 birds. And there was another Christian in the class. I don't think I've agreed with a single thing that you've said this whole semester. I was talking about our public speeches. All 4 of the 2 of us had been on Christ, one way or another. I don't think I've agreed with a single thing that you said this semester. But that thing you did, and then he looked at me. He said, that concert, trying to help that lady that was helping the poor people, I think that was a very good thing. I think that's the way people ought to live. I said, Professor Walter, I thank you for that, because I know how much you do disagree with my basic worldview. And I know we have to cut this off, but I do have one further question, if I might. And he said, well, if it's brief. I said, well, sir, I understand why I think it's a good thing to help this lady who's helping these people. I said, but sir, for the life of me, I can't figure out why you think it's a good thing. He said, well, it's just the way I think people ought to live. I said, well, I got that part. I said, I know that you believe people ought to live that way. I said, but my question was why? Why do you think people ought to live that way? Well, it's just the way I think people ought to live. I said, well, maybe it will help if I ask the question another way around. I said, if instead of coming in here and saying, look, this lady's doing a good work, and I think we all ought to support her in this good work. And when I had done the speech to try to grab them on it. I'd say, Wayne, you gave a speech on this. You could only believe that if you thought it was the right thing to do to help other people. And Frank, you gave a speech on this, and you could only do that if you actually believed that people... And so I went to each person in the class. I went down the speeches they gave, and I said, you've got to believe that it's the right thing to do. And so you ought to come and support this lady. That was my appeal. And as I told you, he had given me $5. This was 1974. $5 was a big deal. I mean, you could get a whole pizza for $5. And I said, if instead of saying this lady's doing a good work and you people ought to support her, I had come in here and I had said, these people are poor. They're a drain on society. We will do a whole lot better if we just get rid of them. I said, if instead of aiding this lady in a charitable work, I had proposed genocide as the solution to poverty, a real war on poverty, I said, what would you say? That's not the way I think people ought to live. Or is there some more ultimate reason as to why genocide is not an acceptable solution to human poverty? Now, I'd have to tell you, when I went to school in the 70s, we're still coming out of the 60s, radicalism is still out there. Sexual revolution is in full sway, the drug culture is emerging and so on. Most everybody in that class just thought this guy was the best thing since sliced bread. I mean, he used to walk around, parade around, and this, that, and the other. He could trash everything of traditional morality, traditional authority, law, etc. And they just thought he was tremendous. And he said, I don't think there is any more ultimate reason. I just don't think that's the way people ought to live. It was as if somebody had opened the door on a freezer and cold air came blowing across the class at that moment. There was just kind of a stunned silence that a guy who had advocated any number of moral causes, against Vietnam, against restrictions on and on what basis was he laying claim to this moral ground? On nothing more than his opinion and his feelings. And frankly, even in the 60s, people recognized that your feelings weren't an adequate basis for any kind of moral judgment. Now, we've kind of lost some of that because people tend to think that your feelings are an adequate basis. That if you have a feeling against them, you've got a truth to be told. But whatever feeling you have is opposed by some counter feeling that somebody else has. And unless there is a moral standard out there that says one is right and the other is wrong, all you will ever have is a test of power as to who can enforce their feelings on everybody else. That's all it comes down to. It will be might makes right. If there's no ultimate standard out there. For Israel and for the world, God lays claim to that standard. You shall have no other gods before me. I am the one source of moral obligation in the world. And there is not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, the Lord of all, does not exclaim, mine. And so as we move into the commandments, he gets just more specific. So in the second commandment, he will lay claim to your worship of him. He will determine how he is to be worshipped. He will set the rules. His name will be honored and revered at all times and in all places. His day will be kept and honored. He will tell you how much time in the week should be devoted. In fact, he's the one that gave you the week. But he will tell you how much of your week should be devoted to public worship and to contemplation of divine things. He will rule that. And then he will rule every aspect of human behavior. All people in authority, all people under authority, all people equal to you in the fifth commandment, and how you respect the lives of other people, not just in terms of their bodily integrity, but in terms of what you think, what you say, what you feel about other people. He will bring under the rule of his law. And the same thing with our sexual lives and thoughts, with the property that he allots to people in his providence in life, with their reputations in the ninth commandment, and with the innermost desires of your heart in the 10th commandment of coveting. Every commandment after the first just descends to greater specifics. First in terms of God, and then in terms of other people. So that when all is said and done, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, the Lord of all, does not exclaim, mine. He has left nothing to us. You say, well, I guess he really is the great bully of the universe. Yeah, if it were just a bare assertion of power, I suppose that's what it would be. Wouldn't be anything you could do about it. All you could do is protest. But it was grounded in his love. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. He's a God of love, who saves people from the darkness to bring them into light, who brings them out from the bondage of sin and death to give them life and life abundantly. He's not just your creator, your redeemer. And that's the ground upon which he calls us to obedience. You're to respond in love because he has loved you. We love him because he first loved us. Well, let's pray. Lord, how we ask that you will indeed work in our hearts and in our lives, that we may respond in love and thus in obedience, to honor you in every way, with every thought, word, and deed, in every aspect of our life, so that your commandments have become our delight, and they are the light to our path to show us the way in which we ought to live. Teach us and instruct us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.